am Professor Lisa Anderson from the Juilliard School, and I am an Associate Professor of Liberal Arts and History. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the wage gap. The wage gap is a term we use to describe the difference between the incomes of men and women, and the fact that men generally get paid more. So we're going to start with a little bit of an explanation. So economists currently estimate that women will not enjoy wage parity with men until 2090. And by examining photographs, statistics, and documents illustrating the wage gap, individuals listening to this lecture will learn more about the historical reasons behind this disparity and then consider its consequences for women over their life courses and from generation to generation. It seems like on some level it should be pretty straightforward that 2090 is a very long time to wait. So the question of how do we have such a wage gap is closely connected to a more social justice oriented question of how do we close that wage gap. Now there's little hints that you can probably anticipate. So for me, in the course of trying to draft this lecture, I was interrupted by children with various questions on the holiday baking championship, the development of the Green Party, a discussion of various politicians' morality, the lyrics to Deck the Hall, and one kid's upcoming tour schedule for chorus. This experience of motherhood is part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer. So you'll have to listen closely and figure out what are the various factors that explain the difference in how much men make and women make, even when they have the same jobs. Now, this difference of saying that women aren't going to earn generally as much as men until as late as 2090, the gap as it currently stands typically translates to about $10,000 a year. And times 40 years, that's a house. The pay gap is even greater for African American and Latina women, with African American women earning 64 cents and Latina women earning 56 cents for every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man. So why have women historically made less money at wage work? Part of the reason lies in occupational segregation. Now, nursing is a very valuable profession, incredibly important, and yet it is also an occupationally segregated profession. And so that's worth paying attention to. So this photo is from the graduating class from Fresno State Nursing in 1970, and you will notice that it is awfully white, but not completely, and that it is 100% women. Okay, so when you look at the photo, you can almost get mesmerized, not just by the hairstyles, which are extraordinary, but also by that just kind of sea of women. Oh no, wait, there's actually one man in the back row on the left. I lied. Okay, but overwhelmingly, you get a sense that this is a profession that was pursued by women. Now, this is Fresno State now, in their same nursing program. You can see that the ratio has shifted. There are clearly men in the photo. There are more people of color in the photo. And yet the occupation itself remains very much an occupation in which women are in it more often than men. So here's some other examples. So if you look at the role of secretaries or administrative assistants, they're 95% women. Truck drivers, however, are only 4.5% women. Primary school teachers, 87% women. Attorneys, 34% women, although that seems to be going up because recent law school grads represent a larger percentage. Physicians, only 32% women. However, again, med school grads, the numbers are going up. So we can see some places where there's a transition where occupations are becoming less segregated by sex, and yet nonetheless, these are still statistically meaningful categories. So part of the reason for occupational segregation, but not all of it, is grounded in the ways in which there have been institutions restricting who is allowed to go into which areas. So historically, these have been pretty profound. If you think of licensing requirements, for example, Myra Bradwell, who couldn't practice law because the Illinois State Bar refused to grant her a license, right? Or the matter of women in combat, which meant that it was hard to advance too far in rank. So sometimes these are formalized, right? And they could be had in a lot of different ways by company policy or anything like that, which outlawed discrimination. Discrimination wasn't outlawed on the basis of sex in terms of hiring or promotion or firing until 1964, when the Equal Opportunity Commission finally was developed. Title IX is from 1975, which outlawed sex discrimination in educational institutions. Or another way to say it is, before then, it was fine and not a problem at all. For me, at least, I remember very clearly my grandma's story of getting fired as soon as she got pregnant. So, in other cases, though, occupational segregation can be a matter of culture. And here I have the prerequisite photo from Silicon Valley. Sometimes women might decide to leave a certain area, or men might decide to leave a certain area of profession because they just overall don't feel terribly welcome there. So really the question is, how does an occupation get feminized in the first place? Now we have a whole bunch of historical examples that I have on the left. Social work, domestic service, childcare, flight attendants. Those are occupations that were always understood until the very recent era as being dominated by women. On the other hand, we can also say that there's occupations that have transitioned, where an occupation that was originally understood to be a men's occupation gets feminized. These include nursing, strangely enough, as you just saw. The other way around, nursing was originally a men's profession. Teaching and secretarial work, which were both understood as primarily men's professions at various points. So how does this happen? Well, unfortunately, the easiest way to explain it is by starting with the premise that many people assume women are less intelligent than men. This is the animating force that makes it a lot easier to understand how occupations transition. Because if women are actually able to enter into a profession, that means that the job can't be that hard. And because the job is easy, it pays less. And women accept the low payment because there aren't a lot of better options. And then the occupation becomes more and more dominated by women, and this cycle continues again and again. So the idea is that in many occupations, especially nursing, teaching, and secretarial work that were initially men's professions, we can actually trace over time the situations in which these jobs get understood as less and less difficult at the same time that women start to enter them, and that quickens the process whereby men leave the profession. Now, one example of this kind of works is the case study of flight attendants, right, or originally stewardesses. Okay, the education that for flight attendants, there was a condition of employment that they actually sign a pledge to resign at age 32 under their collective bargaining agreement, because the idea was that at 32 they would no longer be attractive enough for the job. This kind of tendency to understand the flight attendant's job as easy, right, was linked to the fact that what they were seeing as doing was just being women, not as requiring any particular skills. And at this point, usually when I'm teaching, somebody in the class raises their hand because their aunt is a flight attendant who works really, really hard. Okay? So the idea was that for the airlines, they would hire flight attendants until the very recent era with the understanding that their job wasn't really a skilled job because all they were really doing was doing what women did at home, only on an airplane. This, of course, doesn't quite meet the criteria of what flight attendants actually do, which is quite difficult, right? But the idea, once again, was that if women could do it, and it was just women being women, then it wasn't that hard, and therefore it didn't need to pay very much. And therefore you could do things like automatic firing for a variety of issues that we don't necessarily think are all that great reasons to fire women, and would now be quite illegal. So whatever the reasons that are going to amplify the terms of occupational segregation and the fact that men and women go into different lines of work, even more we can say, well, it's not because women lack education. Okay? So it wouldn't make up all the difference in pay, even if women fled those jobs that were occupationally segregated. But whatever is the reason, it's not because women aren't educated. So here are some of the factors that might explain why occupational segregation, though significant, is not the only way that women wind up getting paid less than men. Okay, so let's take a look. Part of it has to do with occupational segregation. That's our starting point. So for example, in 2013, 74% of the labor force employed in education, training, and library jobs was female. But jobs in those fields don't pay as well as those professions that require a similar amount of training. Those are all jobs that generally require a master's degree. And yet, those jobs also pay less than other jobs with a master's degree. So, and then even more than that, even being underpaid for people who have advanced education, we have this additional problem, which is that women who are in those professions still get paid on average 79% of their male counterparts. So it's not just occupational segregation, it's occupational segregation plus student loans, plus not as much payment for those particular jobs into which they're segregated, and then the fact that in those segregated jobs, men still typically make more than women. That's a lot of factors kind of going on top of each other. So part of this requires that you understand that not everybody has the same likelihood of promotion, even if they're in the same type of occupation. So we can get a couple classic examples right here. Lots of people are active in politics. And in fact, if you look at your local political figures, they're probably disproportionately women. Not entirely, but probably over 50%. And yet when you look at the US Senate, not so much. Not everybody gets promoted up to that level. Not everybody has the same chances for promotion. Same thing, lots of us work for Fortune 500 companies, and yet most women don't actually get promoted to the point of CEO, right? So there's definitely a divergence in terms of who gets the glory of promotion. But even if they're in the exact same job, accounting for promotion, women are on average paid less than their male colleagues. And this includes even areas like real estate managers, where women make 66% of men's wages. Now, nobody would say that real estate was sex segregated, or if they did, they would note that disproportionately, real estate agents are women, right? So why is it that in a field that has a majority, right, of women in its profession, women are still making less than men? Same thing with loan officers, financial managers, attorneys. My goodness, if there's anybody who's in a position to sue because they're getting screwed out of their wages, it should be attorneys. And yet even here, women make 83% of men's wages. Even primary school teachers, remember, and that's a field that is disproportionately women. Women make 87% of men's wages. So there's two occupations that have a pretty close pay equity between men and women, and those are food service and housekeeping. So for just a minute, I'd like you to either go to your course discussion page or simply, talk to yourself or to a family member or whoever else is in the household with you and explain why is it that this isn't necessarily positive for women, that these are the two occupations with the closest pay equity. So go ahead and pause the video for a second. So whatever the solution is, it probably isn't to be more like men. If you take some of the books that have come out recently, there's a sense that sometimes what gets neglected is an idea of how gender works at work. And these are two texts that I think most people are aware of or have read, and I'm not saying that they're not okay. I'm just saying I wish that it was that simple. Basically, men's strategies just don't seem to work for women the same way because they mean something different when they're used by women. So, for example, there's a tendency to blame women for a reluctance to negotiate. But when women negotiate for their salaries, they generally get cast as fairly unseemly people in a way that men negotiating for themselves don't. Women tend to get less mentorship or advising, in part because people in a position to hire tend to hire someone who reminds them of themselves. And sometimes it's because women share a presumption that there's a male breadwinner in the house. We'll talk on that a little bit. But merely asking for the value of one's work is fraught in ways for women that it isn't necessarily for men. So, quick review. What are historical reasons for pay inequity? Occupational segregation. Then, we have this problem that assertiveness is perceived as unseemly in women, even though it's something that's considered pretty desirable, right, for men. But then we have these other factors too, which really start to add up, and which I alluded to in the very first parts of the lecture. Basically, the long kind of point I want to make here is that motherhood costs women more than it costs men. Let's take a look at this in a very literal sort of way. In the United States, we have 12 weeks of unpaid leave. Doesn't quite look like other countries that we generally consider our peers, does it? Maternity leave under various collective bargaining and state policies started in the 1960s, and it only became federal law after 1993. Losing a job meant losing seniority, accrued vacation time, bonuses, and progress toward sabbaticals. The Family and Medical Leave Act offered unpaid leave for 12 weeks. But between 1960 and 1965, only 14% of new mothers went back to work within a year. In 1976, it was 31%, but in 1992, it's 54%. So clearly there's a trajectory over time of women returning to work after they've had babies. And yet that's rather challenging. For example, pumping, which is probably not something you've really considered a lot before. Current guidelines are usually about nursing a baby for around a year in order to help that baby develop immunity, and also as a matter of cost. It's worth noting that feeding a newborn baby with formula, because they don't actually eat solid food till they're at least 4 months old, and solid then just means like rice mush. They're still getting most of their nutrients from milk. But over the course of a year, a mother who doesn't pump when her baby isn't with her, which is basically suctioning milk out of her breasts, and save that to bring it home to her child, is probably going to pay about $1,500 in that year for formula. So if you've ever wondered why formula is behind lock and key at CVS, this is why, right? On the other hand, as you can probably just imagine for a moment, attaching this particular device to your body is not something you want to do in public. More than that, there's a long tradition of women who return to work because women who are new mothers have to pump as many of times a day as their child would eat, okay? Because otherwise the milk flow goes down and sometimes can't come back up again, and then she would have to replace it with formula. It's not like something that you can do as much as you want. It has to be done exactly the same amount every single day. Okay, so if women want to do this in their workplace, it is awkward. And for a long time, the accommodation was to go into the restroom. The problem here being, you don't want to eat your lunch in the restroom, so you probably don't want to make somebody else's lunch in the restroom. It's just gross. But it's only very, very recently, 2010 under Obamacare, that women gained a right to pump at reasonable intervals and not in a bathroom. Sure, it now usually means a closet, but that's a significant improvement over a bathroom. In any case, in order to go back to the workforce as a new mother without right out the door paying essentially a $1,500 fee to return to work in terms of formula, it requires pumping access, and pumping is inconvenient. Now there's another way to relate to motherhood. There's a famous term called the second shift, right? Which is this idea that responsibilities at home are disproportionately carried by women, and that as part of that process, it prevents a deep investment in the career. Now, this applies mostly to women who have salaries in a way that the nursing problem applies to women across the board. But still, then again, there's those instances of straight up discrimination. When you just fire somebody because she gets pregnant or because she turns 32, when you have sexual harassment as your job instead of something that's not supposed to happen on your job, when you are excluded from unions, and when you are underpaid, that constitutes sexual discrimination. So these factors have always gone on, and the question is how to uproot them. So part of this is realizing the way in which personal and occupational factors, things that have to do with structure and decision-making, intersect. One of the classic examples has to do with orchestras and the idea of doing blind auditions, that is, auditions where you can't see the person playing the instrument, but only hear the instrument itself. When these experiments first started with blind auditions for orchestras, almost right away, women got positions in much greater numbers, up 25%. But this was due not only because they were making significant attempts to eliminate discrimination by keeping the people who heard the musicians blind, as it were, but because more women wound up showing up to audition once the fear of discrimination was removed. These kinds of issues related to discrimination and choices and conditions outside work and conditions at work, it's really difficult to pull them all apart. They're all kind of working with each other. Inequitable pay stinks, and it's experienced by women of all economic classes. But arguably even more important, why is it that poverty has historically been much more common for women than for men? And if it's true more for women than for men, that starts to make this graph a little interesting. Okay, so you can see in this one an enormous amount of poverty that's happening for children, right? The poverty for children is because they're children who are raised by single mothers, disproportionately, not always, but disproportionately, and I'll show you some more graphs on that. Why is it that there's more women who are impoverished between 18 and 24 than men? Well, that's because those are young mothers who are caring for those children in poverty. You can see the numbers start to kind of even out until all of a sudden you get significantly older, and at retirement, all of a sudden there's a big difference again. That's going to have to get explained. Lest we think that it was merely a matter of gender, you can again see the ways in which gender and race intersect. So, what factors have historically created and perpetuated the feminization of poverty? The fact that poverty is disproportionately experienced by women. Well, women get paid less. Women who don't live with their parents, this is key, generally don't have a male salary to subsidize their own. In other words, if you're a woman who is arguably underpaid, but you're in a heterosexual relationship with a man, or you live with your father, you still get the benefits of his arguable overpayment. But if you don't, then you don't. There's also the matter of the cost of childcare relative to salary, and the ways in which welfare itself is structured as an institution. So let's go through this list a little. One of the highest indicators for the likelihood of poverty is being in a single-parent home. Why is that? Part of it has to do with the extraordinary expenses of childcare. Usually at this point, I horrify my students by telling them that several years ago, when my children still needed daycare, and I used it only part-time, not full-time, it was still $15,000 each per year for each of my 2 kids. So I was spending $30,000 a year on childcare, part-time. That's very high. The only way you could afford to have 2 kids in childcare was, of course, if you made significantly more than what you were paying for childcare. Not everybody can do that. The other thing is that for single-parent families, the way that there have been structured payments to assist in the care of children has gotten really transformed. Historically, there was an American experiment with the idea of mother's aid, which would be paying mothers directly so that they could raise their children full-time rather than entering the paid labor force. They were, as mothers, doing a duty for the government and for the state in taking care of these children. Whereas now, there is currently a massive transformation in which the idea is that no, mothers should be forced into the workforce, and that they should have to pay somebody else to take care of their children. That the work of taking care of children in and of itself is not seen for unmarried women or for women who are poor to be a legitimate profession. So you can wind up in the kind of peculiar circumstance where a woman winds up working as a nanny in another family, but then has to find somebody else to take care of her own child, and can't afford to pay someone else to take care of her own child. So in that kind of situation, it becomes actually very, very difficult to make enough money to pay for daycare. So welfare activists like the National Welfare Rights Organization with Johnny Tillman really tried to explain this much more widely to the populations that people could understand in this elegantly attired photo from 1968. For Tillman, she claimed that welfare was like a super sexist marriage. Okay. It was the combination of social workers making surprise visits, the fact that no warrant was needed to search for evidence that there was a man in your house, that there was no hearing before social workers or others might discontinue benefits, and that you were only allowed to purchase certain items and required to stay within a budget, whether or not that price is available in your neighborhood, which was particularly a problem as food deserts started to become a real substantial issue. So for Tillman, it was untrue, she noted, that the best way to avoid welfare was through work, because jobs sometimes pay less than minimum wage, especially woman-occupied jobs that are sex segregated. And sometimes childcare costs more than the earning potential of a woman herself. So none of that made logical sense, right? So for Tillman, what she started to argue was the idea that welfare's inequitable and humiliating character were deliberate, that these weren't bugs, they were features. They were deliberate in their design, because it made a threat implicitly against women who weren't on welfare. In particular, she charged, it kept other women afraid to leave their husbands because they knew they couldn't afford to be divorced. Divorce. Okay, let's talk for a minute. It's hard to be unmarried. It's hard to be unmarried and a parent, but it is really hard to be a divorced woman. According to a 2014 report by the General Accounting Office, only 4% of married men and 5% of married women over the age of 65 live in poverty. On the other hand, almost 11% of divorced men and 18% of divorced women have incomes that put them under the poverty line. Why divorce would affect women even more than it affects men requires, again, a little bit of explanation. Both women and men have the experience of all of a sudden having to transition from one household to the expenses of rent or mortgages for each independent person. So it makes sense that divorce would be particularly stressful in that kind of way. But it also has to do with the way that it takes money to make money, and about understanding a little more about how credit cards work. So both those two things we have to explain a little. Okay. The credit history between a married couple all belonged to the husband all the way through the 1970s. So even if a wife's name appeared on the credit card or on the credit report, that was only identification. The actual history, the reputation of paying bills, belonged exclusively to the husband. This was a problem for a divorced woman because she might find herself divorced at age 50, having worked only as a mother and as a wife, which are taxing and honorable professions, right? But without an employment history that other people saw, had the desire to recognize that labor that she had done, right? And without a credit history. If you have no record of employment, quote unquote, and you don't have a credit history, imagine how hard it is to rent an apartment. What is the likelihood that you can get a car? What is the likelihood that you can get a Macy's card, for that matter? Almost none. You have no credit history. You, for all intents and purposes, don't exist, even if you were the member of the family who made sure that all the bills got paid on time. So upon marriage, a single credit history had been maintained in a husband's name for a married couple. And so this was really different. With no credit history, moreover, it meant that a woman who was recently divorced could never get a loan really for anything, including for things like trying to start a new business, right? Or trying to pay for student debt. So more than that, divorced women tend to get less than an equal share of the higher paid husband's retire benefits. So what wound up happening is that you would be a woman who had been out of the paid labor force. So you would either enter for the first time or re-enter the profession in a lower position, in addition to losing the economies of scale, because you now had to pay for your housing and your husband's housing. and without a share of the husband's retirement benefits. So at the moment in which he's able to cash those in, right, a wife would not be. So she'd have to continue working at a low-paid job for a long period of time. And should she attempt to kind of jump the line a little bit by getting a loan that she could use to kickstart her own business, where she wouldn't rely on other people recognizing her skills, she would find it was impossible because she didn't have a credit history. Okay, so the wage gap. Poverty became a feminist issue because disproportionately poor people are women. It's kind of that simple. And because for feminists, they could notice that the consequences of occupational segregation and discrimination and all of these other factors were clear all the way up to the highest level of the professions. Actually, there's even a little weirdness in that the better paying a job is, generally as a percentage, the greater that the wage gap is. And so feminists were already attuned to this issue, and then they could see how the problems of poverty combined with racial discrimination and the ways in which people understood class created a whole category of women, especially older divorced women, who really didn't have an opportunity to gain financial solvency and were put into poverty. So what's the advice or the takeaway from all this? Well, it's really hard in a gender history setting to give any real kind of advice, and I really don't like to do it. But I do feel like I usually start with a mantra of the one thing that's really clear is for men and women, don't marry a jerk. That's really one of the key issues that everything returns to. Marry somebody whose desire for parenthood is at the same level as your own, whether it's large or whether it's small, just that there's an equal amount of enthusiasm, whatever that is. Don't trust anybody who doesn't know how to cook or do laundry or clean the dishes. It's kind of like I'd also advise against marrying anyone with a lot of consumer debt. Things aren't going to necessarily change dramatically, and you don't want to be in a position where all of those responsibilities fall onto one person. Also note, it's far easier to change your profession than it is to change your spouse, and less costly, so make sure you're sure. In the meantime, more politically minded people could advocate not only for increases in legislative protections, or that would end sexual discrimination, and for new forms of evidence that would be accepted in terms of demonstrating a pattern of discrimination, but also for, on the ground, advocating for parenting and family leave as a form of professional development when that seems actually relevant to the profession that a person is doing. Or in that, encourage men to use their paternity benefits so that women aren't unduly stigmatized for doing so. Insist that your workplace has pumping rights that dignify motherhood, even if you're never going to use them. And avoid professions wherein there's a high cost for demanding flexible schedules. And what if you want to go into something totally different? You've already made a vow that you're going to be fair in hiring and fair in promotion and sensitive. Well, if you got all that covered and want to try one more thing, try giving women a 22% discount on anything you sell. So long as the wage gap exists, there's going to be a sense in which women, particularly women who don't have a men's salary to subsidize their lower salary, are always going to be a little more financially unstable. And so to give credit to that and to signal it and to make that more obvious and hence something that everybody can work on, find some way to make sure that that's part of whatever design you have for whatever enterprise you have in the future. Okay, so thank you once again. This is Lisa Anderson from the Juilliard School, and today's lecture has been on the wage gap.